Welcome everyone to a webinar entitled Free Speech. What does it mean to speak freely in today's world? Presented by Rachel Fisher from Pretoria, South Africa, Francis Etheredge from Cheltenham, England, Peter Bruin from Sydney, Australia, with webinar moderator Lawrence Hopperton from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. My name is Sebastian Mahfood, and I'm the director of ITEST. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, ITEST, is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. ITEST explores truth theologically in the wisdom traditions of the human community and in the data studied in the sciences. ITEST's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. Before I introduce our presenters, Father Vincent Uke, retired priest of the Diocese of Trenton, New Jersey, will offer our opening prayer. Father Uke?
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Almighty and eternal God, you have given us the ability to speak our mind. Help us to use this gift humbly and not in vainglory. May you inspire us and strengthen us to be like your Son when he had to confront the bad Pharisees. May the wisdom and understanding of the Spirit fill our voices with righteous persuasion that can quell the anger of those who are ruled by the flesh. May they come to know that their clever ideas, which hurt our and their human dignity, may lead us to a deeper faith in what you call us to do. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Father Uke. And now, I'm delighted to introduce our webinar moderator, Lawrence Hopperton. Larry lives in the town of Stouffville, Ontario. He was the founding director of distributed learning at Tyndale University in Toronto, Canada. He has published extensively on the theory and practice of online learning and won an international award for instructional design in disability compliance. He has also published 4 textbooks on writing skills, 2 chapbooks of poetry, and a full collection, Table for 3, through En route Books and Media, which also published 3 of his chapters concerning disability compliance in a book entitled Teaching and Learning in the Age of COVID-19. His next book of poetry, Such Common Stories, will be released by En route later this year. Actually, I believe it's going to be released by En route in July. So, Larry, welcome, and it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Sebastian. It's still kind of early morning here in Canada. I've got my time zones mixed up, so I've been up since 5, still on coffee. I thought that the way to get this underway, especially since I have a book coming out called Such Common Stories, would be to start with a story. Now, as you know, I founded online learning at Tyndale University. Tyndale is a Christian undergraduate university and a graduate school of theology in Toronto, Canada. My goal, or at least one of them, was to expand enrollments beyond our local draw. My primary focus was the graduate seminary. We built online courses, and indeed, we attracted a very broad enrollment and spread the word. One semester, we had a student enrolled in Wesleyan Studies, and the student lived in Iran. The problem that we encountered was that Iran had banned Christian literature at the border, and the student was unable to get the required textbook, The Sermons of John Wesley. As I say, Christian literature had been blocked, but Iran had not blocked educational websites, and the student was already able to access the Tyndale site and the actual course. Well, after a bit of research, I found an electronic version of the sermons, and then asked the professor if he would be willing to change the textbook in order to accommodate the student in Iran, and at the same time, save his other students the price of the existing text. He agreed, and basically everybody won. Tyndale found a legal loophole around Iranian restrictions, kept a student who was able to complete her degree, and spread the word. All the students saved money, and I got some bragging rights for pulling it out of the fire. It's a nice little morning story, and it's intended just to get the brain going. The story appears to show how the internet can begin to address restricted speech. But it also raises some issues here. First, if a student is living in a sovereign nation, should they be observing the laws of that nation, even if a loophole exists? Secondly, although Tyndale opposes the restrictions enacted by Iran, was our action appropriate? And what if the student was caught? We would be in the position of having facilitated the violation of the laws of the land. It leaves you guessing a bit. On the Christian side, we want to spread the word. This was an opportunity to reach a new audience. On the other side, I think we did put the student in jeopardy. Just a bit something to think about. Well, now let's have a little sip of coffee and get underway. Before I introduce our first presenter, I'd like to remind participants to post your questions in the chat room at the bottom of the screen. We will pose your questions to the presenters at the end of the actual presentations. And now I'm happy to introduce Rachel Fisher. Rachel is from Pretoria, South Africa, and she's co-founder of 3 Consulting, a dynamic firm which offers a range of services. Last screen decides to throw things up at me. Sorry. A range of services including information management, data analytics, business intelligence, strategic planning, corporate governance, and project management. Rachel is also the co-chair for the International Center for Information Ethics and deputy editor of the International Review of Information Ethics, currently hosted by the University of Alberta up here in Canada, and a member of the UNESCO IFAP Working Group for Information Accessibility. The title of Rachel's presentation is Exploring Freedom of Expression in an Information Society. And may I present Rachel Fisher.
Thank you for that introduction, Larry. I would also like to say hello to all the viewers and participants of this webinar, and also to express my gratitude for the supporters and the sponsors for this event. Now, presenting from South Africa, I'm going to try and do it slowly, although our accents tend to not be that heavy, but just so that you could follow comfortably. Now, Larry did provide an overview of what it is that I do, and I realize I sit here with multiple hats as an academic, specializing in information ethics, so coming from a philosophical point of view. But I'm also a social activist in South Africa specifically. And that is why my presentation will pretty much take you on a journey of this information society and freedom of expression. This picture behind me, somebody is smoking, so it might not seem perfectly suited for a webinar, an international webinar. But actually where I'm presenting from is just down the road of South Africa's parliament. Now, our constitution is said to be known as one of the best in the world, particularly due to our history. It's well known, apartheid, as well as our former president, Nelson Mandela. So it would be so wrong of me to have a presentation from South Africa and not to make mention of this. These images represent people that struggled against apartheid and tried to stand for what it is they believe in. And that is why this presentation considers both freedom of expression, but also freedom of access to information, since this cannot be split from each other. But let me first start by asking, do we actually have the right to freely express ourselves or to have freedom of speech? It seems as a very natural assumption or a right to believe in, particularly it's 2022. But where does this notion come from? Now, I would like to make reference to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the promulgation thereof on 10 December 1948, after the Second World War. A quote from the UDHR indicates that whereas the recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, and this is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. There are two very specific articles within this Universal Declaration that speaks to freedom of speech. The first is Article 18, that looks at how everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change religion or belief, and the freedom, either alone or in a community with others, and in public or in private, to manifest his or her religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Secondly, Article 19 states that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and this right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, to seek, receive, impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. So this is already stemming from 1948, and this is an international agreement and a declaration of our human rights. But in many instances, we do battle with this seemingly conundrum of these blurred lines between freedom of expression, which we feel we've got a very clear notion of, but on the other hand, we also have hate speech. So to what extent do we manage what our freedom of expression is, and when it impinges on other people's rights and it influences their sense of dignity, their right to gender expression, racial, cultural, religion, etc. And those blurred lines get very difficult. That is why in our constitution, South Africa's constitution, we have Chapter 2, which is our Bill of Rights. And therein is indicated, Section 16, that everyone has the right to freedom of expression. Similar to the Universal Declaration, it includes the freedom of press and media, the freedom to receive and impart information, ideas, freedom of artistic creativity, academic freedom, and freedom of scientific research. Very interestingly, what the South African Constitution includes, particularly in regards to our history and our current contexts, is that the right in this subsection does not extend to propaganda for war, incitement of imminent violence, or advocacy of hatred that is based on race, ethnicity, gender, or religion, or anything that constitutes incitement to cause harm. So our Constitution has tried to reconcile at least how we consider bringing these two together, allowing people to speak, but also not impinging on the rights of others and sense of safety. Very much it is referred to how Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk had managed to save South Africa from a civil war back in the transitions of our governments in between 1991 and 1994 when our democracy started. Now, a big role in which this was played is freedom of expression, but then again, as I said, our access to information. Now, in our current context, with COVID even, our access to information and communication technologies, social media, and the absolute ubiquitous nature, looking at how easily information can be manipulated and packaged and distorted, we must look at the context of a post-truth era, mis- and disinformation, and even malinformation, which is information designed specifically to cause harm. And that is why we need to consider these two and the balance of this. Let us come back from a philosophical point of view on freedom, or even liberty, as we can maybe use those two interchangeably. Now, Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher, distinguished between two different types of liberty. And those were negative liberty or freedom and positive liberty or freedom. Negative liberty is the absence of obstacles, barriers, or constraints. One has negative liberty to the extent that actions are available to one in this negative state. So it's the absence of obstacles external to the agent. Interpret this as being free from. Maybe many of you that have dogs and children, or, they don't want rules, they don't want guidelines and boundaries, but we all know how essential it is to have guidelines and boundaries, not just for discipline, but in order to raise responsible and accountable adults. So this is necessary, which is why negative freedom is essentially negative. Positive liberty, then, is the possibility of acting for the fact of acting in such a way as to take control of one's life and realize our fundamental purposes. One can think of liberty then or positive liberty as the presence of control on the part of the agent. So to be free, you must be self-determined, which is to say you must be able to control your own destiny, your own interests. See this almost as a free fall. Whereas one then, negative, is the absence of something. The second is requiring self-mastery, self-determination, or self-realization in the means of control and boundaries. We have a third notion of liberty or freedom, and this you can see as a triadic relation in a triangle. And here we see the subject or the agent that wants to make decisions or have freedom of expression, or freedom of access to information. We get the agent being free of certain constraints that keep them from doing something. And then the agent becoming something he or her or them would like to become. So in this triangle, we require three things: the agent, certain preventing conditions, and the doings or becomings of the agent. And those are important for us to consider. Why do we bring this back then for freedom of expression within an information society? I don't know if many of you have dealt with the notions of an information society going towards a knowledge society, and even now they speak of artificial intelligence society. So an information society is essentially what we are currently in, where we are using information as a means to motivate, encourage, contribute to our economies. Much of what we do is built on information, on data. So many of our systems are depending on it. Knowledge is the ability then to take this information and package it in a usable way that others can understand and do something with this. I'm not going to go to an AI society. There is in other spheres in the philosophical tradition of within information science that calls upon a wisdom society. Now, I will leave that to marinate and maybe sit in the back of your minds. But this webinar, particularly, what would a wisdom society entail, especially if you consider ethics, religion, our responsibility towards fellow citizens and citizens of the globe, not just our respective countries. I want to come back to a knowledge society. So in our triadic relation, the agent, preventing conditions, and what they would like to become, we require 4 specific elements to be a knowledge society. These are having a physical infrastructure that is working. Think about roads, water, electricity. We require an ICT infrastructure that is functioning. Many of you might have seen that Maslow pyramid with the drawing at the bottom stating Wi-Fi. So no longer is food and shelter and basic security at the bottom of Maslow's pyramid, we are seeing Wi-Fi. So an ICT infrastructure is required to promote a knowledge economy, essentially allowing us to engage internationally. We also require quality content. So this is content that we know is accurate, fair, well-researched, and is not known for its ability to be malinformation, to cause harm, misinformation, which could be a mistaken information if you didn't look at your sources, or, disinformation is also to go and distract people away from what could be the facts or the truth out there. So the content has to be of quality. And then finally, we need to look at human capability. It's one thing having the physical infrastructure and the content, but if humans do not understand the information they are dealing with, they are not taught, they don't have access to information and quality information, they don't have the right to express themselves, then we are failing as a knowledge economy. Then we are sitting in 2022 and we're failing our citizens and fellow human beings because, and I want to refer back to the global south and the global north, we have immense digital divide and instances of information poverty. And these are issues of social justice. I firmly believe, not only as a South African and a social activist, that we all have a responsibility, if we are educated, connected, and have means, that we are responsible for our fellow citizens. Now, I just want to bring this back, looking at the ICT and physical infrastructure and maybe just ending off in some of these notions. Currently in South Africa, I mentioned this to the panel before we started, we have what is called load shedding. So the shedding of the load on our electricity infrastructure. South Africa is experiencing stage 4, where I am presenting from, close to Parliament, Cape Town. I know even though my presentation states I'm from Pretoria, I am from Pretoria. I'm currently in Cape Town, where Table Mountain is. We have stage 3. Now that means we've got 2 sets of load shedding occurring a day. That means it's 2.5 hours per stage. It's a total of 5 hours a day that we don't have electricity. For the rest of the country, it means 7.5 hours a day that we don't have electricity. Now imagine the impact it has on any working country, our economies, our connections, and then even then the tax base that we could build up. So for us, it's very important then to consider what are our responsibilities to ensure that the basic foundations are there to support and promote freedom of expression. It's not just a notion out there that everybody has a right to, that is floating above and we make assumptions, but it is something that does require very strong efforts and actions on all of our sides. So I wish to thank you once again for this opportunity and listening to our presentation. You're more than welcome to consider and post your chats and comments in the chat section, and we shall get to that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Rachel. That was really interesting. It raises a number of questions, but we'll hold on to those for the time being. Before I introduce our next presenter, and following from what Rachel just said, I'd like to remind everyone to post your questions into the chat room, which you can access from the bottom of the screen, and we will pose the questions to the panel when it comes to the Q&A session following the presentations. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Peter Bruin. Peter lives in Sydney, Australia, where he is a defamation and media lawyer and former member of State Parliament in Australia. He's the author of several books. I just moved my screen. He's the author of several books, including the best-selling The Book of Letters, published by Allen and Unwin. His latest books are Prodigal Pilgrim Letters to Pope Francis from Lourdes, Fatima, Garibaldi and Medjugorje, and Dear Mr. Putin, both published by En route Books and Media in 2022. The title of Peter's presentation is Defamation and Free Speech in the Enlightenment of Depp versus Heard. Peter, over to you.
Hi, Larry, and thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you also to Sebastian for organising the panel, and Rachel for your very interesting speech about what was happening in South Africa. I feel as though we're kindred spirits down here in the bottom part of the world where it's winter, and all those northerners up there with their short sleeves and open neck shirts, it's freezing down here. It's, I think, 7 degrees Celsius. So when Sebastian asked me to talk about an issue concerning free speech, the big issue in the news at the time, and it's only a few weeks ago, of course, was Depp versus Heard, that notorious defamation case, which seemed to turn so much of what we thought about free speech on its head. But of course, since then, we've had 2 other very significant decisions of the Supreme Court only this week. And both of those decisions, one involving the so-called right to keep and bear arms, and the other involving the so-called right to an abortion. And these decisions have been monumental and have changed really the way that I have approached the presentation. So bear with me if you will, because I will chop and change between Depp versus Heard and these other decisions, which are very significant for lots of reasons. And possibly the most significant reason is for the division that they're sort of feeding in the community, the division about, you know, what we actually believe about women's rights, the divisions about what we actually believe about gun ownership and the right to keep and bear arms. So anything I say that's controversial or that you don't agree with, you should alert me to it, because, you know, everyone's going to have different opinions about these issues. And some of the opinions that we hear are going to be, in our world, offensive. And so it's important, I think, to make the point that when we say things that are disagreeable to other people, we need to be aware of that and to be conscious of the fact that they're going to have different opinions, and we want to have dialogue. We don't want to have confrontation. And that's the challenge for everybody, I think. There was a time when London was the defamation capital of the free world, until the British Parliament introduced a series of changes to defamation law to require people to address the notion of serious harm before they commenced proceedings. Other constraints were also introduced. And back in 2020, Johnny Depp brought an action against the Sun newspaper for claiming in a report allegations that he was a wife beater. Johnny Depp ran that case at great expense and lost in the London court, the London High Court. And the court found that 12 of the 14 allegations against him that he was a wife beater were proved. So that represents the background in another common law jurisdiction outside the US, where the judge, there was a judge sitting alone, had no difficulty deciding that Amber Heard had been treated badly to the point of labelling Johnny Depp a wife beater. When the Washington Post published an op-ed piece by Amber Heard in which she claimed to be a victim of domestic abuse, Depp brought another defamation action, this time in the Fairfax County, Virginia, which was the home of the Washington Post. So Depp brought both cases. He brought the case in England in the High Court against the Sun newspaper, and then he brought the case against the Washington Post in Fairfax County. And I expected, personally, as a defamation lawyer, I expected that the evidence that was so clear in the London case would have been sufficient to in effect, to stop him from being able to bring another case in another court. And if he decided to proceed, that it would be futile. That was my opinion. And it was the opinion of a lot of other lawyers as well. When he eventually won the case, because it was a jury case, there was, in the legal profession, in other common law countries, there was shock horror, because London was no longer the defamation capital of the Western world, but it had been moved to Virginia. And so that's the issue that concerned everybody, that a jury decision provided little protection for Amber Heard when, on the objective facts from the London case, she should have been able to at least argue that she was in a position where she was actually a victim, whereas in the case itself, she was treated as a perpetrator. And to me, that seemed like an injustice. So what she said in the Washington Post that caused her to be sued was a very small number of words. I think there were 12 words in all. And those 12 words said that she was the victim of domestic abuse. And one would have thought, I think, that as a result of the previous case, she could argue that she was the victim of domestic abuse. But the court in the US, the county court, Fairfax County Court, decided that that was defamatory, that she should be the subject of a damages award. And the court ordered that she pay Johnny Depp $10.5 million in damages. She also received something back because of something that his lawyer said, which meant that the net amount that she had to pay was $8 million. Now, she can't appeal that decision. The cost of the appeal is absolutely prohibitive. She may think, and she has said publicly, that she has legal advice that she can appeal, but the reality is the cost of the appeal is just prohibitive, because she has to actually pay the previous verdict into court before the court will give her leave to appeal. So that's the reality of defamation, that, you know, you think you have free speech, you can say what your constitutional rights suggest you can say in the First Amendment. You can say what you think, you can say what you believe, but there are other issues that we have to take into account and we have to consider, because, you know, speech is actually not that free. You know, there are a number of things that prevent us from saying what we can. You know, there are things like perjury, there are things like incitement, there are things like defamation, of course, and various other restrictions on free speech, which prevent us from saying in many circumstances what it actually is that we think or believe. Those two cases that I mentioned previously, that involved the First Amendment, the one in New York was the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. That case was decided 6-3, that a person had the constitutional right not just to keep arms, but to bear them. It was a case about whether carrying a gun, a handgun, in a concealed place on your body, whether that was legitimate. And the Supreme Court found that it does infringe the right to actually not just keep arms, but to bear them, and that the word bear includes keeping a concealed gun. So that was a surprising decision to me. To others, it was obvious. To the National Rifle Association, it was a fair call. They said, I think that you know, you should be able to carry arms anywhere outside the home, that they shouldn't be confined to the home. And the court agreed with that argument. In the other decision, of course, the decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organisation, that case was also decided 6-3, and it referred back to the states certain bodily integrity rights established in Roe versus Wade. Speaking as an outsider, it seemed to me that the so-called entrenched rights in the USA are not that entrenched at all, that they can be moved from one group of judges who have a particular view about the law to a subsequent group of judges who say, well, look, you know, that's just not the way we think the law works. And so, you know, that's a controversial aspect of the American justice system, which we don't really have in other common law countries. And it's to do with the separation of the judicial and executive powers of the government. And in other jurisdictions, there doesn't seem to be this controversy about appointing judges. I remember being quite amazed back in 2016 when a number of organisations, the Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation and others, offered election support to presidential candidates willing to appoint Supreme Court judges who were likely to overturn Roe versus Wade. Now, that to someone from another common law country is kind of encroaching on the difference and the separation of the judicial and the executive power of the government. Anyway, the rest is history. Donald Trump has appointed 3 judges who were practicing Catholics, taking the number of Catholics on the court from 3 to 6 out of a total of 9, even though Catholics are just 20% of the American population. Now that raises some issues for Catholics, whether there are going to be repercussions for Catholics in Catholics being involved in such an important decision when we're such a small part of the overall population. So, you know, there are controversial questions that we're going to have to answer because suddenly we're part of a minority. So, you know, we're not used to being a minority. In fact, I read just the other day that the Pew Research Centre is about to publish statistics that suggest that people who believe in the Christian God are about to drop, the numbers in the US are about to drop below 50%. So the whole of our Christian belief, our Christian ethic, our Christian history is suddenly going to become in the US a minority belief system. So, you know, these are issues that we have to face up to. As Bob Dylan often said, the times are a-changing. So I don't want to go on any more about these cases. I don't want to appear as though I'm taking a particular point of view which would cause offence or insult to people, but many people are convinced about the importance of human rights. You know, Pope Francis has said a number of things about mercy and about justice and about the importance of other aspects of human life, you know, poverty, homelessness, treatment of children, and the list goes on. So, you know, we're going to be in a situation where we're going to be asked to line up for or against one side of the Roe versus Wade argument. And I think that's very divisive. I think it's very bad for the common law countries generally, not just for the US. And so I would like to see there be some kind of reconciliation. I have no idea how that might happen. But I think it's important that we have a level playing field so that we all understand what our human rights are, and so that we all somehow recognise that we're all fragile, we're all part of the same community, and we just need to be able to somehow work together so that we don't have this constant regurgitation, if you like, of what it is to be human, you know, what it is to have certain protections. And it seems to me that that kind of discussion is going to have to be made, or is going to have to be had at a point in time where there are other important issues that are also causing controversy and division. War in Europe, concern and divisions about the environment. It seems to me that we all need to encourage each other to sit down and agree on some, common bases whereby we just can't afford, I don't think, to have these endless confrontations, disagreements and divisions. And if anyone wants me to address any other aspects of those concerns, I'd be very happy to do so. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to speak about them.
Thank you, Peter. Most interesting. I think we'll come back to questions in a bit. Please remember to post your questions in the chat room. I now do give this a second. I'm having some wrestles with my computer. There we go. I'm pleased to introduce Frances Etheredge. Frances, who lives in Cheltenham, England, is a Catholic married layman with 11 children, 3 of whom he hopes are in heaven, and the rest of whom are alive and well and stepping through life's stages of school, university, and career. In the last 7 years, he has returned to being a self-employed writer, adding 12 books, astounding, 12 books to the one already published. Find his books on bioethics at On Books and Media. These are The Human Person, a Bioethical Word, Conception, an Icon in the Beginning, Mary and Bioethics, an Exploration, The ABCQ of Conceiving Conception, and Reaching for the Resurrection, a Pastoral Bioethics. Forthcoming later in 2022 is his new book, Human Nature, Moral Norm. Frances' presentation is titled, Is Speech Ever Free? And over to you, Frances.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Sebastian, for this forum. My point of departure, in a sense, is an ordinary one. We are as we are. I am in a room in which I work, which, as the children were small, was a playroom, is now also a place of computers for all different kinds of activities. So really, it's this point of departure. And one of the aspects which I've been considering in front of this seminar is the language of rights. In a sense, it removes us from our own reality. The language of rights is necessary in terms of identifying a constitution, identifying legal relationships. But one of the things that it's borne in on me as I've reflected on this contribution is really that I live. To call my right to life a right, in one sense, is the articulation of it in legal terms. But in another sense, it's the very fact that I live is a witness to being alive and to what being alive entails. The fact that it's necessary to speak in order for another person to know who I am. And that witness can be either in terms of the nature of friendship, to unfold a dialogue, to comment on my own history. I mean, there was a point in my own history when I swore not to speak. The sufferings one goes through as a child can result in a kind of resolve to be silent. And one of the things I experienced as I grew up was the absolute necessity of articulating those inner sufferings, because in a way they strangle the very nature of what it is to be a person, because that consciousness of what we are going through, of what we understand is happening to us, in a way is very strangled if we don't actually articulate it to anyone. And so as a child, this was very vividly expressed in the fact that I ran away. I also tried to commit suicide. And this, in a way, makes very tangible the fact that the inner nature, the nature that seeks an outward expression, is something really embodied, that we're not abstract beings. It's true that we can identify ourselves in terms of rights, but really there is something of a living reality that somehow needs to be recovered, that even when people are opposing, for example, abortion, and they're coming at it because of the grief that they can see, because people women have done awful things to themselves, or others have helped with that reality. You know, there is a tremendous pain, you know, that there is no suffering in this situation without pain. You know, either we have lost a child, as I have, through abortion, and there is a profound pain, or the woman has undergone this tragic experience, and there is a profound pain. What we're looking for then is something which helps us identify our human nature in a way which goes to its roots, which allows the reality of our lives to speak to others, to identify ourselves. But there is also, if you like, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, it's in the nature of grace to build on what human nature is. And so this question of witness, you know, that if I recognize, as I have, that Christ has come into my life at 40, is quite an extraordinary reality as to why, if you like, just as he passed through the door of the apostles in the upper room and was present to them, so in a sense he communicated to me through reading the Catechism of the Catholic Church when I was 40. After many serial relationships going nowhere, many studies coming to nothing, I began by going back to the study of theology, because one teacher in my background growing up asked a question that lit a light, and that light never went out. As much as I tried exploring any number of other subjects, the one question, the one enlightenment, if you like, that really set fire to my imagination and inquiry was what is the nature of baptism? And this never went out. Now, Christ in his own time came to visit me, like he came to visit the apostles in the upper room. And it was through reading the Catechism that I come to give you life, and life to the full. But in the Catechism passage, it said quite simply that if God can create everything out of nothing, he can make a new beginning for the sinner. And for some reason, this identified me, this helped me identify myself as being the one who is the sinner, as being the one who needed to be recreated. And I didn't just take it on board as an idea, as a text. In a way, it changed me. I went back to a Christian community that I've been a part of called the Neo-Catechumenal Way, and I went on a pilgrimage. And this helped to unfold who I now was. And it even entailed a chaste courtship and a marriage, and I've now been married 25 years. Now, these are extraordinary events, but they are events that arise out of a human nature that is, as it were, empowered to identify itself, and for that identity to be communicated. It's not something that, in a sense, can exist without being communicated, because having persevered, if you like, with a silence in my own life, I know very well how throttling it is, as I've described it. So this power to articulate ourselves is in one sense a right, is in another sense essential to life. You know, just as I breathe, so I need to speak who I am, and that has many layers. And there are many different ways of approaching this, but the power to identify ourselves that we express verbally is indeed a power. I mean, in the book of Proverbs, it speaks of the tongue being like a rudder, you know, that the whole ship is steered by the nature of this small instrument, the tongue. And so in a sense, I want to begin, although having begun, with looking at the fact that every word has consequences, every silence too. And this is a quote from Sartre. And so we can think, in a way, the very primordial expression of both the consequence of speech and the consequence of silence is very evident in Adam and Eve. Adam did not speak. Eve did. And in their absence of their dialogue, we have, as we understand it, this primordial expression of the mystery of original sin. But in the very nature of being silent, you know, we have, in a sense, an identity as men, an identity that I live with myself. You know, what is it to be silent? I know in a psychological sense what that silence entails. You know, it entails a kind of strangulation. But there is also another kind of silence, because not only do these realities live in us as one reality of being a human person, and the very nature of person is to be in relationship. None of us conceive ourselves, but we are conceived through relationships. We are not only conceived through relationships, we are conceived in relationship to a God who fundamentally brings about our existence as a unitary existence. So relationship is really so fundamental to what we are. Now, we also live in a society where there are so many ways that we are influenced. And we could say that this influence is both formal and informal. You know, we can speak of the informal influences as the fact that a child, for example, can have a discussion with his contemporaries about the nature of what it is to be a woman, and he can right away find himself in a culture that calls him misogynistic, a woman hater, just because of the possibility that arises in the other person that he may actually endorse the rights of human beings from conception. So this notion of free speech is a very subscribed reality. You know, already we have seen very vociferous and violent demonstrations in America and in other parts of the world over other questions. But even in an ordinary, if you like, everyday dialogue, a person can discover that their desire to speak becomes really quite radicalized. You know, am I prepared to be recognized as someone who sees the life in the womb and simply wants it to exist, just as one wants the life of the mother and the father to exist? You know, our speech really, in the terms in which we live, in the society in which we live, comes right away with immediate consequences because of this kind of background within which we live. So there are also, if you like, formal elements. You know, at the moment there is in front of the Parliament the Higher Education Bill, because it's so charged, this atmosphere of, am I able to speak, am I going to be pilloried, that now there's a higher education bill in front of the government of this country in England, which is proposing, and this is extraordinary, is even proposing that there be a right for different opinions to be expressed. Now, how is it we've got to that point where in our society it even has to be legislated for that a pro-life speaker can appear at a university without being pilloried, or a university lecturer can express a contrary opinion to a prevailing idea without being ousted by social media? You know, the questions that arise, the reasons why the law is invoked, indicates that already we are in a society which is vivid and in certain sense is livid. You know, the capacity to be reasonable, the capacity to listen, the capacity to articulate an argument, to go from evidence, is really something which increasingly perhaps we are challenged by as human beings. You know, there is a plethora of evidence about the beginning of life, for example, and yet I can read a text by an eminent author, and he can say, well, when does life begin? You know, there is life in the sperm, there is life in the egg, the two come together. You know, the question of just understanding the simple fact of when conception takes place, and yet there is an abundance of evidence. So our capacity to, if you like, listen to the evidence, to begin with the investigation, as Aristotle or any good philosopher or scientist will do, they will begin with their evidence. And what we find is that, in fact, when the sperm approaches the egg, one, in the normal case, one will penetrate the egg and they will form a wall, and that wall then becomes impervious to any subsequent sperm. The very nature of that wall is an activation of what was the egg. So now you have a living entity, and an entity that has expressed itself in a living action of that of enclosing itself within a wall. And as even the Warnock report reported in this country, there is an uninterrupted development whereby this human being that has begun manifests itself, because there is no discontinuity from the moment of that activation, as it were. And as we believe philosophically and theologically, the ensouled person begins at that instant. Now, there is no point of discontinuity from then on. Whether you have twins, it doesn't matter, because from the point of view the twin exists as a separate person. And therefore you have two lives, as it were, from one. But the point being that there is an uninterrupted development. Now, as discernible as this is from the evidence in which we live, and the evidence around us, from our own very existence, none of us brought ourselves into existence, and we are, in that privileged sense, arbitrary judges of the existence of another person, when our own existence is a witness to the fact that a life unfolds and becomes a particular person, a person who then goes through the whole psychological and spiritual development of articulating who they are. But how extraordinary it is that this becomes a privileged position. This is the common knowledge from time immemorial, that we begin in existence. We don't begin through a thought. We don't begin, as it were, by an accident. We begin in virtue of a gift of existence. And that gift is irreplaceable. You know, we don't give it to ourselves. The fundamental equality, you can say, that each of us has is the fact that we have all received the gift of existence. And so the very fact that we can consider that this isn't the common case, that there are people who are not receiving life, is quite extraordinary. And so our capacity to enter into this dialogue is very, what should we say, charged and circumscribed, so that really we have to grasp again what are the obstacles to sharing the reality that we live, because the reality of our lives comes before our articulation of it. And so this notion of free speech, I mean, it has, as I say, so many ramifications, because if you're a child of 14 now in this country, in England, you can go to the doctors and you can be prescribed contraceptives. But where is the picking up on the freedom of information Where is the presentation that actually a contraception, a hormonal contraception, obscures the vital indicator of a woman's health, which is ovulation? What we don't hear about is the consequences of taking away the natural evidence of the body. Now, that's an example in terms of hormonal contraception. Already, the person who's going to the doctor, unless the parents have some dialogue with that doctor, or the child is excessively well informed at 14, they are already going to be receiving a certain kind of information, an information that doesn't even do credit to the natural science of a woman's health. You know, as in, it doesn't point out that as soon as you start taking hormonal contraceptions, you start losing the vital signs of your health as a woman. So there are many ways that this society in which we live has already prejudiced, even in an institutional sense, the outcome of a dialogue, so that in fact, we're not very often in front of the whole facts. We're very often in front of a point of view, and a point of view that doesn't enter into dialogue, but a point of view that is already prescribing itself as true. So I just conclude with the fact that I think the dialogue we're invited to enter into is the dialogue of truth, but it begins from what exists, and that we have to be capable of looking at what exists candidly, okay, not as in through the point of view of, you know, the billions that are spent on hormonal investigations, you know, never mind the tragic mistreatment of Puerto Rican women when these things were done surreptitiously, or the withholding of antibiotics when, you know, experiments were done on people in America who were suffering from syphilis. So the antibiotics were withheld, and doctors who wanted to treat them were threatened. You know, there are many implicit ways that this notion of being free is so circumscribed. You really need to investigate the truth if you're going to have a foundation from which you are going to start. So I conclude really with the 2 points. You know, the first is, what is the starting point of a dialogue? If it's not reality, if it's not something from which we have understood, from which we have drawn to make sense of what exists. And then also, it's the fact that we live in a fallen world and we need help to be in a dialogue in a way which loves those we disagree with. Thank you.
The Q&A is now open. I see that there is at least one question sitting there already, but I'd like to just get things started here a bit. It seems that there is something of a consistent theme coming out here. And I just wrote down, giving the fallibility of human thought. What is the reference or the relationship between divergent facts and point of view? If we're going to talk about a dialogue of truth, what about if that truth is being avoided by the avoidance of divergent opinions? And as I take this a step further, I look at the issue of control and anarchy. And from our internet standpoint, we have sitting on the far side that dark web out there where there is no control, which leads both to positive and negatives. So what is our relationship? What is our responsibility in freedom of speech to consider facts that are divergent from our own point of view? Rachel, maybe I could start with you. Any thoughts?
Larry, you actually got me there because Elaine asked me a question to me directly. Might I just make sure, because I did catch the end, if you would like to repeat, please?
Yeah, what I was saying is the considering the fallibility of human thought, what is the relationship and the responsibility to pay attention to divergent fact? If we're avoiding facts that are contradictory to our own opinions, are we in fact exercising free speech, or is it something else?
Okay, thank you, Larry. Elaine, if you don't mind, I know you asked me directly, but I'm going to read out your question on this. Elaine also asked me about me discussing negative and positive speech. And she asked, in the case of negative speech, who or how are the guidelines set for what consists of negative speech? Now, I'm actually connecting this to your question, Larry, in the sense that with it comes what I mentioned on positive and negative liberty, so not positive and negative speech. Where it came to speech, I spoke about those blurred lines in between, that very ethical dilemma gray area. We are very clear as to freedom of speech, and we are very clear as to hate speech, but what occurs where those lines blur? And where they blur and it becomes difficult, I want to bring it to a pluralistic society, and that jumps off Kevin's question, is that we cannot be a diverse society or a nation if we don't allow for divergence and even a conflict of opinion. I think it's too dangerous, to be honest, in today's society to do that. I know that one has your principles that guide you in your decision-making daily, not only towards other people, but also to remain true to your faith. But if I want to bring this to intercultural communication and looking at diverse sets of values, just as we have our own sets of values that we feel strongly about, it's insisted upon perhaps to remain true or authentic. We are grounded in those principles. So are other communities, individuals, and cultures grounded in theirs.
Yes.
So to not be accommodating of that becomes unjust. And as soon as we deal with issues of justice, and by, I keep on saying impinging, but as soon as it comes to delimiting the rights and opportunities of other people, that's when we start seeing protests. That's when we are starting to see problems, especially within a democratic society. Bringing it back to South Africa, it would be very bad, if I can just put it bluntly. Because we have 11 different official languages, more so that are spoken than what is seen as being official. And most of these big language groups have got their cultural groups.
Yes.
Not only are we looking at values, we are looking at identity. And at no point can we say someone else's identity has got less or more value than another. So I'm absolutely pro-pluralism, pro-diversity. The problem, once again, or not the problem, the dilemma comes in that center space where the lines get blurred and there becomes uncertainty as to how we manage that difference. That's a long answer, but it kind of touches on some of the questions that have been asked from my perspective.
All right. Francis, would you have anything to add here?
Well, clearly, one of the great gifts is of a society that can enter into dialogue with each other. And there's a lovely expression in Dignitatis Humanae, one of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, on the dignity of the human person. And that refers to the nature of truth, that truth has a power and a gentleness. Now, one of the problems that arises is that space, as it were, being given to the truth to exercise its inherent nature as persuasive, as gentle, as informative. Because one of our difficulties as human beings, especially where the questions touch us acutely, personally, in terms of what we think are our rights, is the way in which the dialogue becomes inflamed. But one of the characteristics of truth is this persuasive gentleness, and that really is something to meditate upon, so that what we actually are in a way doing is providing not just an opportunity for us to speak to each other, but to listen to the nature of this truth that is capable of being persuasive and being gentle. And that seems to be more, there seems to be more hope coming from that nature of truth than perhaps we ordinarily recognize.
Okay, thank you. Peter, I'm curious from a more legal standpoint about this relationship, the responsibility to attend to divergent opinion. And we've seen in a number of countries what happens when people don't. There was the coup in the United States. We had a rebellion up here in Canada over these issues. But in both cases, it looks like sides are not paying attention to the others, to divergence. Your thoughts?
Look, can I answer that question with an example of my own family? I'm one of 8 children, and we all have divergent points of view about fossil fuels, about climate change, about representative democracy, what that means, about whether we should be red or blue, or in the case of Australia, whether we should be Liberal or Labor. And, you know, we simply have to learn to live with other points of view. Australia is, I think, at the moment, the most culturally diverse country in the world. It used to be Israel, but now it's Australia, I understand. And so that means that we are coming up against other cultures and other belief systems all the time. And we can't afford to just say, look, you know, I'm right about this. I know I'm right. It's in my genes. It's my faith. And although I can't prove it, I trust and believe it's true. Somebody else with a different culture, a different religion, different education can say exactly the same thing about their perspective, and there's a sense in which we're both right. And there's another sense in which we're both wrong, because there can only be one truth. And the difficulty always is to persuade the other person or the other group of the veracity of what your position is, if it's in confrontation or conflict with their position. So ultimately, these things are worked out whereby there's an accommodation, and generally the accommodation will sit with the majority view. And I think in a democracy, that's the only way that you can resolve those differences. Because if the majority aren't recognised, and if the majority ultimately don't get their way, then it's not really a democracy. So, you know, these are very difficult issues, and we're confronting them all in ways that we never thought that we would have to. And we're really having to go to the trenches for our beliefs if we truly have faith that our belief and our point of view is the right one.
Okay. I'd love to follow up, but I want to get off to the questions from the floor. This first one from Elaine Weissman. and I think this is probably pointed at you, Peter. I'm not familiar with Amber Heard and her suing Depp in England, but here the first question to those few words is proof. The result of her words was loss of income for him. It was readily believed, and he lost reputation and income. So it had to be with evidence, which is what he was after. That seems to be focusing on the question of proof behind truth.
So Amber Heard said in the Washington Post that she was a victim of domestic abuse. Now, that was all she said. And those were the words that the jury had to consider. She didn't even refer to Johnny Depp. She simply said that I know what it's like as a woman to be the victim of domestic abuse. Now, I don't know how they do it in Virginia, but in Australia, you would have to, the first thing you would have to prove is that she was referring to Johnny Depp.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I don't know how they did that. I tried to work it out from the case, but it seemed to me that it was just presumed as a fact that she was talking about Johnny Depp. But the reality is that those words in themselves, in my opinion, didn't cause him any damage at all above and beyond what had already happened to him in London, where he had been proven to the satisfaction of the court as the perpetrator of being a wife beater. So, you know, how the court in Virginia could just ignore that finding is something I don't understand. But I think it would be dealt with on appeal if they could somehow find the funds to run an appeal. But the defamation law being what it is, it's only for the rich and the very poor.
Yes. Thank you. Here's an interesting question. How can a pluralistic society enforce a freedom speech? How can it punish speech which is defamatory, intentional disinformation, or designed to inflict emotional harm? And I think, Rachel, I'll start with you. What do you think?
So as I included in the presentation, in South Africa's constitution and legislation, it is mandated or included to what extent this right is, what is included in it, and what it does not extend to. So this is propaganda for war, incitement of imminent violence, or any advocacy of hatred that is based on race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and any act that constitutes incitement to cause harm. So South Africa is very much a pluralistic and diverse society. We do have clear legislation stating what is excluded and included. So if as an individual you do feel that those rights once again have been impinged on, or that you have been targeted, or if something was published that can look at, well, especially with apartheid, at any form of discrimination, you can prove that, then you can take that person to the court. It happens rather regularly in South Africa, particularly if you get social justice, other activist groups and political parties to support. So it's something we're extremely comfortable, aware of and uncomfortable. It also makes it very difficult because everything you say does have to be politically correct. Coming back, you know, the term that younger people use is having a woke society, which once again impacts on your sense of authenticity and what you believe in. So there we definitely have this very bad tension between freedom of expression and hate speech. But in our society, what does extend to quite strongly is that our socioeconomic circumstances are very dependent on us not discriminating, you lose your job.
Yes.
Easy as that. If you discriminate, particularly against another race, and there's evidence, you will lose your job. So you don't even feel it by rule of law, you feel it in your pocket and your stability. So yeah, it's very much entrenched, and it's used quite often.
Yes. Francis, what I'm really tied up with that word punish. If freedom of speech is allowed, does that not mean I have the right to make defamatory statements? And if we look at Western society, we see this all over, from Britain to Australia and South Africa. We certainly see it here in North America. Is punishing defamatory statements a violation of freedom of speech? Francis?
In one sense, we have to know each other. So you wouldn't want in the first instance to deny someone the opportunity to make the claim they're making. But that is a beginning. You know, one can be too quick, especially invoking the law, for it to become a case of go to the courts, because there is also, what is the dialogue about? You know, is someone insulting me in a sense as a kind of reflex reaction? But even if that were true, you know, what is it that I need to listen to in this person who has taken this offense in what I've said, that they need to express themselves in this way? And one of the things I go back to is when I've been researching in one way or another the background to Roe v. Wade or any of these laws, is the sense of outrage a woman experiences when they see what happened to other women prior to laws permitting abortion. Now, I can recognize that outrage. I can recognize that there is a human tragedy here without taking offense, in a sense, because of how this person is presenting what they've seen, what they may even have witnessed. I don't have to take offense, because it may be crucial that I hear what is at the root of this outrage, because in one way it is outrageous that the degree of harm that a woman has gone through is profound. What it still needs to be heard is who else is suffering in this situation. And that is the difficulty of replying when the cry of outrage is so loud. But at the same time, it has to be heard. And even if I draw the fire, as it were, to myself by identifying that there is another life involved, or drawing attention to the fact that there is a silence, the fathers have been silenced. Now, what of these other realities in this situation? In some way, there has to be a drawing of the hurt that enables people to hear each other.
Interesting. Peter, do you have anything to add here?
So on the question of defamation, the thing that we condemn most in other people is the conscious intention to do harm. Now, whether that's physical harm or emotional harm or financial harm or reputational harm, we are entitled to protection of our reputation, of our person, of our identity, and in order to do that, the law provides for redress, and hopefully it can be a simple apology or a correction. In cases of serious damage where people have lost business or suffered financial loss as a result of something you've said that's defamatory, then in the absence of resolution, you ought to be entitled to protect your reputation, even at the expense of some other person's freedom of speech, because these rights are always going to be butting up against one another.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to be resolved. The differences have to be resolved. And it seems to me that if people won't, if they're not satisfied with an apology, then it has to be resolved in some context where there's, you know, a winner and a loser. And unfortunately, that's the way the system works. In an ideal world, people would just turn the other cheek, as it were. But personally, I would never sue for defamation, knowing how it all works. But people do, and the plaintiff, the person suing, their reputation actually goes on trial. It's the plaintiff who's in the dock in a defamation case, as Johnny Depp was in the Depp versus Heard case, both in England and in the US. And to my mind, Tonto and Jack Sparrow have suffered much more, in my opinion, than Amanda Heard. And, you know, I think that the reality of that sort of retribution is that the person who initially brings the claim or makes the case needs to recognise that they're on trial. And many people, after bringing defamation cases with the benefit of hindsight, would say, look, you know, the damage to my reputation caused by the slur or the derogatory remark, that damage is nothing compared with the damage I've suffered as a result of going through a long, drawn-out, expensive court case.
Yes. Okay, on to our next question here. This is from Thomas Leahy, and I'm going to add a little bit to it if I can. Groups tend to take their values and look at others as misinformation, and this seems to be a root cause. If a majority are incorrect, how are the value and truth reconciled? I am thinking something like the report of Caleb and Joshua opposed to the other 10 spies and their outlooks on the prospects of the promised land. My thinking is the core there is on the rule of the majority. And I'd like to add to this, we recently had an election here in Ontario, that's equivalent to a state. And one party was elected. Now, it was the lowest voter turnout ever, under 48%. And this party, in fact, got 19% of the total eligible vote. This brings us to the issue of silence again and responsibility. But so here we are with the question about the rule of the majority. And, you know, Francis brought this up already. When that rule of the majority actually does control everything, and even if it is wrong, you know, I personally have a lot of disagreements with some aspects of American government. I have disagreements with aspects of the Canadian government. But at what point does the statement of the majority, this goes back to the story I told at the beginning about Iran, the statement of the majority carry whether it's right or wrong? Francis, can I start with you?
In one sense, it's necessary to look at things historically. I mean, the example of Caleb and Joshua, who came back from reconnoitering the promised land, and yet were outvoted by those who found this a dangerous situation. This was a question of faith. So I'll answer it in two ways. One, from the point of view of the question of faith, that what they were asked really in being sent to scout this land was what they encounter, will the Lord prevail over it? 2 said yes, the Lord will prevail over it, because they had the experience of the Exodus, they had the experience of being brought from slavery. So they had a real experience. 2 recognized that the Lord would prevail over what future difficulties they encountered. So this, in a sense, is the question of faith. Now, the question of faith is not irrelevant to a situation where there is a majority contrary to what you recognize as true, what you recognize as true from your faith. But it doesn't remain there, because the question of providence, the question of is the dialogue an opportune moment, because a conflict, in a way, proposes that there are unanswered questions, or questions that haven't been clearly articulated and therefore clearly answered. So the fact that you may be in a minority isn't the end point. It's rather, what are the reasons you're in a minority? What questions still need to be answered? What experience needs to be brought to light? I mean, I was thinking of the Canadian situation. People have entered into, if you like, euthanasia without really understanding its human impact. And there is increasing research that doctors who, if you like, in good faith, have entered into these practices, have then suffered as a consequence because they cannot continue with what they've started doing. And so there is a sense in which inadvertently people can enter upon a path that there still needs to be evidence gathered. Now, we could forecast, if you like, the possibility of a conscience rising up against a person. But at the same time, we live in a society where these ideas will be put into practice. But at the same time, we can't overlook what are the fruits of these ideas. What is its impact on people? Now, clearly, one impact is the death of people themselves. And also, you get, if you gather the evidence, you have, for example, a woman during COVID, unable to see anybody. As soon as she elected for euthanasia, she was surrounded by people. The human discrepancy between, on the one hand, being isolated because of a fear of contamination because of an illness, and on the other, no sooner does a person elect a certain course of action than they're surrounded by people. There has to be a kind of an awareness of what are the complexities in these situations, what evidence is arising about how we are living and treating each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's never a static situation.
No, it's not. Rachel, would you like to add anything? I see you pulled a note.
Yeah. Ja is Afrikaans for yes. Okay. I'm going to latch also on a bit to what Francis said, or respond, or maybe go contrary. We'll see how it ends up. Yep. If we take it back to philosophy and Plato, he would argue, and he was, I want to say, negative to the notion of democracy, demoskratia, and power to the people. Saying that if it's the majority and they are the ones making a decision, that can become a concerning event. If they are the ones molding society, politics, economy, legislation. Now, I'm going to bring it back to South Africa. In the instance where our vast majority, the majority of our population, have been the ones at the receiving end of many years of subjugation due to apartheid. So, Francis, you asked, perhaps one should consider why you are a minority group, and what does that align to? Maybe what can you learn from it, do about it? In the South African context, being white, specifically being white and Afrikaans, we are a minority group, but we were the minority group implementing and maintaining apartheid. So it does go to show that after democracy being a minority group, no longer being in the position to subjugate others, which links with my previous point that if you are caught to discriminate, you can lose your job because you were a propagator in the past of such discrimination of a majority. You do take responsibility. Even if it wasn't you and it were your forefathers, you still carry that burden. We have another situation, and that I brought in with notions of literacy and the information society, that the majority of our population have got substandard education, not having access to tertiary and even secondary education. Now, these are still results and consequences coming from apartheid, where the government back then limited the amount of access to education that these communities could receive. And after democracy, that hasn't been fixed. So we're sitting with an adult literacy rate of about 87%, which looks good technically. But in terms of media, information literacy, digital literacy, it becomes problematic. Now, when you're dealing with disinformation and the manipulation of information, you're sitting with the current government that has the ability to convey media messaging and information in a way that is most conducive to their own needs. And you've got a majority of more than, I think it's 40 million, 35 million of the population receiving such messages, which isn't a bad thing. They need to stand up for rights, inequality, and past prejudices. But you are dealing with instances of poverty. And poverty as a means, now I'm flipping it, where I said you can lose your job if you discriminate. If you are poor, you can also make money. So it's also a means to an end. I want to respond, though, to Thomas Lay's question about groups taking their values and look at others as misinformation, and this seems to be a root cause. I want to disagree. They won't see it as misinformation. Misinformation is unknowingly and mistakenly giving information about something that is inaccurate, maybe outdated, but you don't do it on purpose. You don't do it deliberately, and you don't do it to cause harm. So it's not misinformation. I would actually say it's either misinterpretation or misunderstanding. And that then comes back to why dialogues with others are necessary. Alterity or difference must be explored. So I don't think it's or misinformation in this instance. Our cultural differences, and it comes also to language, and perhaps maybe not doing enough to step out of our cultural, gender, religious, ethnic comfort zones to get to know the other better as a philosophical and everyday concept.
Okay. I've got two directions to go right now, and I would be interested in knowing, from your three presentations, do you have any questions for each other? That's an open.
Can I ask a question, if I may?
Absolutely.
In the context of that last question, really. These two court decisions of the last week, one involving the rights of people to keep and bear arms, and the other involving what were thought to be the rights to abortion. These two decisions are both contrary to what the majority of the US people want. Now, that, to my mind, is a very serious problem. If you're going to have minority decisions of the Supreme Court, two of them so close together, about two very important issues to all Americans and all people, you know, that's a recipe for disaster. And it seems to me that whilst there's a lot of celebration going on, especially among the US Bishops' Conference, that we as Christians and as Catholics in particular are now in a situation where we're facing up to being the representatives of what is a minority view in the general community. And I, for one, don't quite know how to deal with that. You know, it's kind of unprecedented that we're not part of the majority. And if the Pew Research Centre is correct, and that is that people who believe in the God of the Christian Bible is about to drop below 50%, then all of us are in minorities, and we're all in a position where we have to justify our existence to a majority of the population. That's my question. How do we do that?
I think that's a good, I'm going to throw that one open while I mull it over for a minute.
You haven't answered any questions, Larry. Come on.
I know I haven't. I have to think. And, you know, with the US just south of the border, and the fact I'm down, I always try and avoid a long discussion about what's going on there. When I'm asked down there, I'll typically say I'm Canadian, my opinion's irrelevant. However, that's why I mentioned this election we had here in Ontario, where a government has received a majority mandate based upon 19% of eligible voters. And so now the question becomes, what do we do about it? Because clearly the majority did not vote for this government. But I think that, you know, in this case, we have a multi-party system, whereas in the US, it's more of a black and white decision. And what has happened up here repeatedly is vote splitting, so that the more left-leaning side with multiple parties, the votes are all over the place. On the more right-leaning side, there's only one party, and that's who's getting in. The discussion that's currently going on in Canada, in Ontario anyway, is should the act of voting be revised? Should we move away from the first past the post into something more like proportional representation, more like Israel, which really dooms you to a long-term minority government? And that often leads to stalemate, as we have seen in other countries. So my basic feeling, and I think that a number of the things I've been pointing at take you there, is the responsibility of the individual for the right to freedom of speech. A right is not a privilege, and it's something that needs to have the effort put into it. As many people do, or some people, I have very carefully taught my children the importance and the duty of expressing through an informed vote. They, like me, have not missed an election since they turned 18. It's that issue of that silent majority. Are they simply, are we capable of simply manipulating them into the louder expressed opinions of more of a minority? Or do they have responsibility to express their opinions? Is that a responsibility we have to freedom of speech? And if we opt for silence, does that negate our opinion? We're getting into the more legal ground. Peter, could you begin with that one?
What point did you want me to address?
Well, specifically, if you are silent, if you refuse to engage in the dialogue and the search for the ultimate truth, does that then negate your opinion, whatever that opinion might be?
Well, my gut reaction to that is yes, it does. Just as someone who doesn't vote in a system such as they have in the US, someone who doesn't vote can't then complain about the result of the election. We in Australia have a preferential voting system, which means that, and it's compulsory. So,
Yes.
Over 90% of people vote. They would rather vote than pay the $20 fine for not voting, which is extraordinary, really. And it seems to work in the sense that they have to number all the boxes as well. So ultimately, even though their preference is number one, they have to then put 2, 3, 4, and 5 down the list as alternative preferences if their number one falls over. So it means that all the votes go down the line and someone's going to get elected on your vote. In the first past the post system that operates elsewhere, if your candidate or your choice doesn't get elected, then your vote isn't counted. And so I think the preferential voting system or some kind of proportional representation does solve that problem of the silent elector, because, we don't have silent electors in our country. Everyone votes.
Yes. Yes. Okay, there's one more question here I'd like to get to, but I'm going to ask something else first, and that's, Rachel, you mentioned just in passing the role of artificial intelligence in knowledge societies. And this is one I've been wrestling with a fair bit, because on the one side, I see it as a facilitating tool. On another side, and especially in the light of what we're hearing, that AI as it stands now has inherent biases. Is this in fact appropriate to be trusting AI? At Tyndale, I always avoided it and felt that if a class became too big, rather than putting in AI applications to deal with it, I would rather have a second class, pay the professor. But let's give the opportunity for the students to speak rather than relying upon AI. Would you have an opinion on that?
It's a loaded question, Larry.
It is.
It is. So I'm going to start first and foremost, coming back to information ethics. There are two big streams in information ethics: computer ethics, digital ethics. One is a professor at the University of Oxford, Luciano Floridi, and his stream, and he has developed an information philosophy that undergirds his arguments, where he says everything in the infosphere, from data, computers, mobile devices, AI, have got, I want to say, you have an ethical obligation. They've got intrinsic worth or value. I'm making this very simplistic, sorry. The other stream is rooted in hermeneutics. So, dialogue, interpretation, and understanding, in the school of Raphael Capurro, also informed by Hans-Georg Gadamer and Martin Heidegger. And this argues specifically that it's only humans that have intrinsic worth and value, morality embedded. You cannot embed morality in AI because that morality is then linked with autonomy. So, for us to make our decisions based on conviction or belief or responsibility. If you look at morality to autonomy, you also then look at responsibility or holding to account. So if I go and kill somebody, if I go and steal, that is a crime. I can be held to account, go to a court of law, sue somebody, get a fine, etc.
Mm-hmm.
How do you hold an item or an entity in the infosphere to account if there are damages? You just switch it off, pull out the plug, Control-Alt-Delete, end task. What do you do if there are massive complications, accidents, whatever it might be? So that is my first answer to a very loaded question, is I firmly believe you cannot situate morality in an artificial and autonomous system, because there's a failure to hold to account, which only I believe humans can. I would be very worried if, and there are, for decision-making, autonomous weapons, autonomous vehicles to make those decisions instead of humans, even in law, in courts. So for me, that's scary. Secondly, though, and this comes back to the initial discussion on majority-minority groups. If we are looking at those that have the power when it comes to AI and AI systems, in which is managed, also fed by big data, those are in the power of a few elite groups, multinational corporations. I want to say Gamak, it used to be Gamak, Google and Alphabet, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, now it's Facebook is Meta. Even with Elon Musk, it's a very small group of people that have the access, the means and the funds to these technologies, ICTs, data, the storage, the usage of it. And this is not a national, it's an international concern. So in the AI society, what is happening is financially, economically, and then decision-making, because if you've got money, you've got power.
Yes.
Those elites have got access and the means to manipulate what we have access to. We look at algorithms that screen the information we get, the news we get, the shares, the likes based on your preferences. So you get stuck in an echo chamber or a filter bubble. So you don't see other types of information going contrary to your own interests and belief systems unless you actively go and search for it. And you're going to make YouTube and Facebook very confused when you start searching for different things because you want a holistic approach. So that thing in the society is we're already looking at a very decreasing middle class base, generally speaking, internationally. So we're seeing a growth in lower income classes, lower to middle income groups, a diminishing middle class group, and then this very elite few that has the power to sway. The reason the middle class is getting smaller is because your lower and lower to middle income groups can still do manual labor, but yes, which can also be replaced by AI, such as, assembly of vehicles. But your middle class in terms of decision-making, data, administrators, clerks, those are the ones most susceptible to AI. So in your loaded question is, where is autonomy? Who has got the power with the elite few, because money is power? And then in an AI society, what will happen to our sense of security, our sense of belonging, and our worth and contribution to an economic society? And all of those are influenced by AI, and it will probably only get worse.
I agree with you. Peter Francis, would you have anything to add here on this issue of AI?
Well, in one sense, an AI is an expression of human beings who designed it.
Yes.
So it would seem obvious that if we're talking liability in those people who have identified, built, launched the system, whether it's an autonomous vehicle or whatever it is. Liability doesn't reside in a machine. Liability resides in those who've made that machine. And if that's the question, then it would seem that's what has to be carefully examined. Because one of the problems, as has been pointed out, if you have enough money and enough influence, the danger is that you override international regulations, international treatises, and therefore on a different area in bioethics, you wonder how has experimentation on human beings begun when, quite clearly, when the United Nations formed its Human Rights Charter, it expressed quite categorically, each one of us has a right to life. And yet we live in a society that has multinationals exploiting human life. So you have to identify real human beings. It's not enough to discuss something, if you like, as an institution or as a process of operation or as an object. You know, in the end, it is human beings who make decisions.
Okay. Peter, anything to add?
Look, I think my question about being in the minority is one that we haven't addressed, but I don't think that we have time now, and hopefully we can do it perhaps by email or some other way.
Yes. We have a couple of minutes left. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's where I've been trying to get to, is that question of majority versus minority and its relationship to freedom of speech.
In a sense, it seems to be an unnatural polarization to contrast minority and majority. Because if, for example, as with the case of Roe v. Wade, the question was, does the American Constitution allow for a right to abortion? It was an examination of the Constitution, its historical development and all those kinds of things. So to polarize the question is, in a way, to miss the point. It's not about minority or majority. It was about answering that question of the American Constitution. Now, that would appear to be the case, whatever the question is. It's not so much about minority or majority. It's about what is the question to be answered, and is the answer reliable?
Look, I think that's right. It was a narrow issue in a sense, but it raised the broader issue of, you know, what are the bodily integrity rights of a woman who finds herself pregnant and doesn't have the support systems, you know, maybe doesn't have anywhere to live, doesn't have a partner. I mean, these issues are something that the majority of the population would support the woman and whatever it takes or whatever needs to be done to help her to overcome her difficulties. And in the mix is the prospect and possibility of abortion. The majority of the population supported, even though it was inadequate in many ways, the position that was taken in, 49 years ago in Roe versus Wade. And a majority of the population, therefore, is now disappointed to see that law, for all its defects and for all its deficiencies, go out the window, basically. And that's the problem that we have. We're facing up to the majority of the population disagreeing with the ruling of the court. A majority of the population on all the surveys that I've seen, given a choice, would rather have seen Roe versus Wade stay as it was and deficient as it was as the law.
Interesting.
The requirement of humanity isn't supplanted by questions of law. The prior concern of the situation of the woman is ever and always a prior concern. In the polarization of the debate, it doesn't cease to be significant what a specific person is going through and what help they need. The point being, it is help that endures.
Okay. I think we're getting down to the end of our time. I'd like to thank all three of you for being with us today. It's interesting, you get started and then this thing starts taking on tentacles and spreading, and never really gets to the resolution other than we believe in and want freedom of speech, and recognize divergent opinions, and that we have a responsibility to at least listen to each other, to at least engage in the debate in the search for truth. Sebastian, can I turn it over to you, please?
Certainly. So thank you, Larry, for your moderation over this session, and thank you, Francis, Peter, and Rachel, for your presentations. These have been most excellent. And in fact, I think at the end, we stirred up a bit of a nest for another webinar at some future point.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to invite Elaine Weissman, the director of the Center for the Study of the Great Ideas, to close us in prayer. Elaine?
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Dear Lord, please help our world to learn what understanding can do to help us know the right things to do and not to think or act without examination. Christ exercised free speech and was punished by death. He did forgive everyone on the cross for not knowing what they do. Please help us to learn to know what we ought to do so it cannot happen again. Thank you, God.